Welcome to another lab in Network Support Services, Windows Networking. I will be hosting this lab in HyperV. You as the student will follow along, answering all questions and taking the appropriate screenshots as shown in your worksheet. So let's begin. Welcome to 70-740 Lab 7, Installing and Configuring Hyper-V. This will be a fairly short lab. We're going to be doing an exercise where we're going to install Hyper-V. We'll be looking at delegating virtual machine management, and then for our lab challenge we'll be implementing nested virtualization. As you saw in the introduction, this will be hosted in Hyper-V, so you'll be taking your screenshots and answering the questions as we go along. We'll be working with our SVR1, so I'll go ahead and get that started right now, and also with our DC1. So our first exercise is installing Hyper-V. Well, often you'll install the Hyper-V role using Server Manager. In this exercise, we're going to use the dism.exe program to install the Hyper-V role on our member server. Hyper-V is a hardware virtualization server role that enables you to create and manage virtual machines, that's VMs, using a virtual switch. By using hardware virtualization, you can subdivide the single physical computer to be subdivided and allocated to multiple virtual machines. So let's go ahead and let's get logged into our SVR1. And here we are. And we'll go ahead and authenticate. Remember, authentication is providing your credentials and that your authorization, what you can do, is tied to your authentication. Okay, in SVR1, the first thing we're going to do is we're going to click Start and go to PowerShell. And before we get started, let's answer some questions. From your lesson, what type of processor is required to run Hyper-V? This is question number 1. What type of processor is required to run Hyper-V? Well, it needs to be a 64-bit processor, right? But what is that technology that it needs to have? SLAT, second level address translation. So the answer to question number 1 is a 64-bit processor with second level address translation parentheses SLAT technology. Question number 1. Question number 2. What hardware options must be enabled to run Hyper-V? We read about this in our lesson. Well, if it's an Intel board, you have to have the Intel VT enabled. That's the Intel virtualization technology. If you're using an AMD board, you have to have the AMD virtualization or AMD-V enabled. So Intel VT or AMD-V must be enabled, and hardware enforced DEP, data execution prevention. It's also called Intel DX or AMD NX bit must be enabled. So what hardware options must be enabled to run Hyper-V? Question number 2. Intel VT or AMD-V must be enabled, and hardware enforced DEP must be enabled. Okay, now we've answered our question. Even though we're running PowerShell, we're going to run a command. Remember, it's easier just to use PowerShell. We don't have to switch to command prompt. So we're going to do a DISM, and we're going to use the commands /online and then /enable feature. Now we have to specify the feature name. That's followed by a colon and the feature. It is Microsoft hyphen Hyper-V or V. Just like that, no spaces. So space before each one of the slashes, but there's no space in Microsoft-Hyper-V. Go ahead and press enter. DISM is going to load. It's enabling the feature. Should be done. There it is. Now, to run Hyper-V, you have to restart. So we're prompted to restart, right? We're going to go ahead. We're going to say yes. It's enabling the feature. We've already restarted. We're coming back up. Just about done. And here we go. One more reboot. Should take just a few more moments. We'll just sit back while it... Oh, there we are. Okay, so let's go ahead and get logged back in. Didn't take long at all. It's a great thing about solid state drives. If you can get it, obviously they've dropped a lot in price over the past couple years. They used to be very expensive. Now they're still more expensive than a standard rotational drive, but they've come down a lot. Get yourself a solid state. It'll make your virtualization experience much different. Okay, so we're back in server 1. Well, we've got Hyper-V installed, but we don't have any way to manage it. Now, we could do this from another computer. But let's go ahead. We're going to go to Manage. We're going to go Add Roles and Features. We're going to click Next, Next, Next. On our Roles page, we're also going to click Next. What we're going to do is we're going to scroll down here, and we're going to look for the Remote Server Administration Tools. And under the Role Administration Tools, we're going to expand that and see Hyper-V Management Tools. We're going to put a check there. And we're going to click Next, and then we're going to click Install. We're going to allow those management tools to install. I'll be right back. I'm going to pause the video while that installation goes on so you don't have to watch. I'll be back in a moment. Okay, so it was only about 10 seconds, but that's fine. Go ahead and take your first screenshot and paste that into step number 13. Okay, we're done with our first exercise. Let's talk about delegating virtual machine management. We're going to add a user to the Hyper-V Manager's administration group. By default, Hyper-V allows the administrators group to create and manage virtual machines. You can grant administrative access by adding a user to the administrators group or to the Hyper-V administrators group. However, you can also allow a non-administrative user to create and control virtual machines by using the Authorization Manager console. So let's jump over to our domain controller because we're going to create a new user account. And that's opening up over on my other screen. Here it is. We'll go ahead and we'll get logged on to the DC. Server Manager should be here in a moment. Yep, there we go. We're going to go Tools, Active Directory Users and Computers. We're going to go ahead and right-click the users, and we're going to say New User. The new user we're going to create is Jim Tachi. Now, if you're a fan of sci-fi, Tashi is the name of the ship in the sci-fi series The Expanse from the Martian Congressional Republic Navy. It's epic ship in sci-fi. Our username is going to be jtashi. That'll be our logon name. We click Next. And we're going to specify our same system password that we've been using all along. And we're going to say password doesn't expire. Next and finish. There's Tashi. We're going to go back over to our SVR1. We can close out the installation wizard, and we're going to go Tools and Computer Management. This is local computer management. We're going to expand the local users and groups. Remember, on a domain controller you don't have any local users, but on our member servers we still do. We're going to select the Groups node, and then what we're going to do is we're going to double click on HyperV Administrators, and we're going to click Add. Now, let's answer question number 3 before we go any farther. When you specify a group or user, what is the location that you'll search in? Well, what does it say on the screen? We're going to select an object, a user, a service account, or a group from where? From datum.com. Question number 3 is datum.com. In our search dialog, we're going to type in Tashi. And we can there should only be one match, so we should be able to just press enter and have it accepted. And it did. There it is. And we can see it's a domain account. Let's go ahead and take another screenshot and paste that into step number 12. If you've got your screenshot, I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to click OK to accept that. Tashi is now a HyperV administrator for this local system. We are done with what we're going to do to this server. Let's do our lab challenge. Now, we've already got a virtual machine, right? We're going to activate nested virtualization for this virtual machine. This will enable us to be able to create, okay, let's back up a second. Remember what nested virtualization is? It takes the ability for a HyperV client, a VM, running on your HyperV host to turn that client VM into a HyperV host. So a host running on a host to be able to create other virtual machines. Windows Server 2016, this is the first that this was available, supports nested virtualization. This allows a HyperV guest virtual machine to become a HyperV host and run a HyperV guest operating system. Just one last time, in other words, it allows you to run a guest virtual machine in a guest virtual machine. Let's take a look at how we do that. Now, you can't do that in ACE-IT Labs. We cannot do this if we were doing the MOAC Labs online. You have to do this on your physical system. First and foremost, what I'm going to do is I'm not going to create a new machine like the instructions would say we normally should. I'm going to do this to our Win 2016 core. So in our lesson we talked about some of the requirements that you need to have, right? Well, first we need to go into the settings for that core machine, and under the memory we need to disable dynamic memory. And that takes us to our fourth question, just as we just stated. What must be disabled to implement nested virtualization? Question number 4. Dynamic memory. The answer to question 4 is dynamic memory. So we're going to go ahead, we're going to do that. We're going to disable by unchecking. And then the second thing you have to do is you have to set your amount of memory to a minimum of 4 gigabytes of RAM. That is the minimum that's required. We'll click apply. What else do we need to do? Well, it needs to be turned off, right? Well, it is off, so we're good to go there. What we have to do is we have to open up PowerShell. We're going to right click on our PowerShell link. We're going to run as administrator. There we are. And we're going to run the following PowerShell command. It is set VM processor dash VM name, and our name is Win 2016 core, another space, dash expose virtualization extensions. Another space, a $true. We press enter. It accepted it. No error, right? Go ahead and take a screenshot and paste this into step number 8 in your lab challenge. At this point, that Win 2016 core machine is ready to have the HyperV role installed, and we could create virtual machines on it. Virtualization within virtualization. Going back to the movie Inception, a dream within a dream, right? We talked about it in the lesson. Don't use this in production. You can use this to do testing. Would not be very efficient in a production environment. First off, you have to disable that dynamic memory. Having dynamic memory is a great feature because your systems don't have to have a chunk of memory allocated to them. They can use whatever they need within a certain range. So when there's no CPU load and there's no memory requirement, you might have, for example, Windows core systems running with half a gig of RAM or less. It just depends. Much more efficient using the dynamic memory. So, as I said, this ends the lab. One last thing I'm going to do before I end the lab is, though, I'm going to revert my core back to the way it used to be. I'm going to run the same command, except this time I'm going to say false. This will disable the expose virtualization extensions. We're done. I can exit out of PowerShell. I'll go back into the settings for that, into our memory. We're going to enable that dynamic memory, and I'll reduce this back down to 1024. In fact, it probably doesn't even have to have that much to start up with, but we'll leave it at that. You'll notice that it runs with a minimum of 512. It can utilize how much? A terabyte of RAM, but they never do, right? We click OK. We're back to where we were. Thank you for viewing 70-740 Lab 7. It's been a pleasure. We'll catch you in the next lab.